also cannot just say that Vladimir Putin operates and or behaves in a manner in which it's just like, oh, well, he has no control over what he does. I mean, this is purely the work of the United States. No, doing that is completely intellectually dishonest. And at this point, to be honest, completely asinine to continue down this route. But it is a very interesting and frightening time for elements of either progressives and leftists, of whom you will see people like Infrared decidedly despise, very similar to Duginists. It's one of the reasons why Caleb Maupin has spent so much time trying to push this narrative that is breadtube serves imperialism. Breadtube serves imperialism. Now, I see there's obviously this problem that's happening a lot online where people are doing this thing where if you post something about what is taking place in Ukraine right now, they're going to respond with, well, what about Palestine? And 100%, like, I'm going to be approaching all of this from an internationalist perspective, okay? Cosmopolitanism. I'm not talking about, I know it sounds like a very bougie term, but if you hear about it and read maybe the books, Michael Brooks, as his final his final book spoke a lot about this, but viewing humanity collectively as equals, that we are all part of a shared experience, unlike, the doctrine of neoliberalism, which of course is to lower markets and let the markets, result in the best possible outcomes for other countries, even though it turns out that richer nations tend to, exploit poorer nations as a pattern. International cosmopolitanism would be, and I know there's going to be people like the Alex Joneses of the world. It's like, he's talking about globalism. This is the exact same thing about globalism. No, it's that we have a shared human experience and that we want the best possible outcomes for everybody, regardless of their race, their gender, their sex, or anything. And to view the world through a lens of which we do not want to exploit other people in other countries and other worlds. We do not want to, impose dictators in other countries that are going to be more favorable or comparable to our values and beliefs in order to be able to get, better extraction of their resources. That is the exact opposite goals of what I'm referring to. So there is this kind of like, if someone posts a story like, hey, by the way, here's something horrifying that happened, to a hospital in Kyiv or something like that, and then immediately the response is like, well, what about Palestine? Then what you're doing there is that is kind of the meme. That is the all wars matter meme, right? People can talk about one selective horrifying event, and you can also speak about another selective horrifying event. It doesn't need to be like, well, this is this. I think what people are trying to do, and sometimes well and sometimes bad, is to point out the hypocrisy, and there's an incredible, massive liberal hypocrisy right now by people who are, of course, unbelievably beside themselves and outraged what is happening here, and then, of course, they will not bring up what is happening to Palestinians ever, right? Like they won't ever bring that up. That is also completely valid to point out people's hypocrisy, all right? I'm talking about the difference between doing that, but if someone is to tell you, if I made a post right now about this is just happening in Palestine, there was a 14-year-old boy, Palestinian boy, who was just killed, and then he responded with, well, why aren't you talking about Ukraine? You're doing the exact same thing, just in the opposite direction. So I'm trying to remove that. And one thing when speaking about this issue is that we've gotten to a point now where people seem to want to consistently bring up the United States and only the United States, as if the United States is the sole aggressor globally. Now, the United States is, without question, the global superpower. They have the hegemonic control over the planet. They have 700 to 800 military bases stationed around the world. I'm never going to discount that. But if you are getting to the point where you are trying to remove any and all agency from Vladimir Putin, as well as by doing that in the process, you're removing any complicity he might have in the actions that he and his military are taking in invading Ukraine, a sovereign country, then you have completely lost the plot. You see the world through the lens of only like the United States is the only country that can ever and always will do any evil. Like you can take a break. You get to sit this one out for a couple seconds and talk about what's happening in real time. That's not to say that you should ignore the history of what is happening and how that plays into it, okay? So as far as I want to talk about the 2014 uprising, yes, the United States was involved in this. There has now been secret tapes that have been leaked. The U.S. role in managing the coup was exposed in a leaked 2014 audio recording of a conversation between Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt, where they planned to sideline the European Union. They said, quote, fuck the EU, as Nuland put it, and shoehorn in a U.S. protege as the Ukraine's prime minister. At the end of the call, Pyatt told Nuland, we want to try and get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help the midwife this thing. Nuland replied verbatim, so on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's come back to me via VFR very quickly, saying you need Vice President Biden, and I probably tomorrow for Attaboy get to the deets to stick. So Biden's willing. So yes, the United States once again was involving itself in a global, in a crisis that was taking place in another country for its own geopolitical strategic aims. That is true. That is a matter of record. You can go to, it's not even like, you don't have to go to far leftist publication Salon to find that out. You will see the U.S. involvement in the actual Wikipedia article, because I know some people like to turn to Wikipedia as the authority on these topics. But in a recorded phone conversation leaked on the 4th of February, Assistant Secretary Victoria Nuland and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, are heard discussing their wishes for Ukraine to transition to an interim government, and specifically the roles they hoped and wish to see the prominent opposition leaders. Yes, this is true. You cannot use this exclusively now as a justification for the actions of Vladimir Putin. You cannot use this as a, well, and so you see, Vladimir Putin just had absolutely no control over what he decided to do. It would just seem that the United States is actually technically controlling Vladimir Putin in this. Like, by that point, again, you're losing the plot. You could be intellectually honest about these things and still recognize what Vladimir Putin is doing. Okay? Yes, it is absolutely feckless and ridiculous, and to be honest, just utterly asinine. Because yes, we can talk about far-right politics in Ukraine, but what I think is really, really important to note, in the 2019 Ukrainian parliamentary election, all major Ukrainian right-wing parties formed a nationwide united party list with political parties: Svoboda, the National Corps, the government initiative of Yarosh, and the Right Sector. However, the resulting coalition only managed to win 2.15% of the popular vote. So again, if you are going to label the entire country, that is false. Like, and it is utterly absurd to do that at this point. You could be intellectually honest and call out the Azov battalion, as you should, because they are fucking a neo-Nazi paramilitary, and also say that the entire country of 43 million people are not fucking Nazis. God damn. Stop it. Like, it's making people look ridiculous in the opposite direction. And it's removing people's ability, like if you were to label all of Canada as Nazis because we have a PPC party and people who associate themselves with the far right, or that we have, militia groups in this country like the Knights of Odin as being completely and 100%, well, now Canada is overcome with neo-Nazis. Even if that was the case, which it's not, but even if that was the case, does that justify Vladimir Putin invading us to denazify us now? Is that where this logic is going to lead us? In some countries in Central and Eastern Europe, roughly 1 in 5 adults or more say they would not accept Jews as fellow citizens. In Ukraine, that is 5%. In Russia, it is 14%, according to a Pew Research poll. Another thing that should be pointed out. So that leads us to something that we have to discuss when we're discussing people who are pushing these points. Now, I know that Russia Today, Caleb Maupin, Infrared, and everyone else involved in trying to push the talking points of Russia Today, I guess I can put this picture up here, have now been trying to say that, hey, all the stories that are coming out have been falsified effectively. There are propaganda stories that are coming out and being promoted very heavily in the West, especially by social media in the West, that, yes, turned out to not be true. The ghost of Kiev, turns out that story is not true. The 13 soldiers who laid down their arms, who didn't lay down their arms and told the Russians to go fuck themselves, and then were all shot. It turns out that they are not, in fact, dead. Them, quote unquote, debunking these stories or whatever, what they're debunking is they're debunking social media stories. That's what they're not debunking the actual on-the-ground statistics and numbers. Again, look to people who actually understand this kind of stuff and will analyze this kind of stuff. Not myself. I turn to people like Chelsea Manning, for example, to look at the data that she's providing and the information that she is providing, because she has a much better understanding of these topics than I ever will. So what they're debunking in real time is the fucking social media stories. And okay, well done. You've won. You've collectively won in debunking all this part. But anyways, I've been wondering for a while, if you start watching, where exactly is the rationale and the explanations behind a lot of this new idea. We're talking about the multipolar world, multipolarity in the modern era. And this idea that we have two emerging powers. We have the emerging power of NATO and its allies, and we have the emerging power of Eurasia, as well as a contingent of an association there. This is, of course, going to have to bring us to the part of this where we talk about Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin, I'm sure all of you know, is the founder of the National Bolshevist Party in Russia. They are, of course, a far-right nationalist party that uses lefty aesthetics, and oftentimes now is being downplayed by both Caleb Maupin and Has as being a misunderstood, controversial, yes, but misunderstood right-wing figure. So if you want to understand Dugin, the reason I'm using Counterpunch right now is because I figured anything that I say about Alexander Dugin is effectively going to be accused of being liberal propaganda or, imperialist propaganda. I don't think there's anyone worth their salt that could consider Counterpunch to be a liberal or a pro-imperialist, think piece in any way, shape, or form. In his September 2015 Counterpunch piece, A New Chapter in the Fascist Internationale, Alexander Reed Ross highlighted the state of the Fascist Internationale in recent times, underscoring the role of Russian fascists and the fourth position theorist Alexander Dugin and his networks in it. What is, however, not widely appreciated about the current state of activities by these Duginist networks, especially in social media, is their active recruitment efforts in the left. So this is something that is happening, obviously, right now in real time. Twitch streamers are doing this. People like Caleb Maupin. I'm sure you all remember his little speech.
But I find this moment to be somewhat pivotal for me. To be sitting here next to Alexander Dugin. You know, the first time I heard the name Dugin, it was thrown at me as an epithet. And it was in 2014. And at that time, I was a card-carrying member of a Marxist-Leninist political party. And at that time, folks will recall the overthrowing of the elected government of Ukraine and the installation of a pro-Western regime. And as that was taking place, I, based on my understanding of how to understand the world and the training that I'd received as a Marxist-Leninist, it appeared to me that what was happening should be opposed, and that, that the forces in the East who were resisting this regime being imposed by the West, that they should be supported. And around that time, a number of people began to denounce me in left-wing circles. I was called NAZBOL. I was called a Strasserist. And one of the favorite epithets that people began throwing at me was I was called a Duginist. And I did not know what a Duginist was. I did not know who Alexander Dugin was. So I had to look into this. I had to look it up. And around that time, I was also traveling. In 2014, I first visited the Islamic Republic of Iran. I attended a conference in Iran. And I was in Iran, and I saw in Iran a society that had broken free from Western capitalism. Their national industries were under the control of the public, the oil was under the control of the public, the banking was under the control of the public, the state was working to mobilize the population to raise the living standards. It seemed to have broken free from this free market capitalist system that we had in the West. And when I was in Iran, I remember at this conference I attended, many of the guests from around the world said to me, "You've got to read the writings of Alexander Dugin." And then, oddly enough, I went to Venezuela. I was in Venezuela in 2015. And in Venezuela, this was a Marxist government. The leader was quoting, Lenin and Trotsky and such. But I noticed that there was a clear difference in the way that the activists in Venezuela were talking. They talked a lot different than the leftists in the United States talked. And when I brought this up with the Venezuelans, they said to me, "Oh, you really ought to read Alexander Dugin." And so, with all of these people mentioning Dugin to me, with people accusing me of being a Duginist, I thought it would be best that I actually study the writings of Alexander Dugin. So,
and then a revelation occurred. I'll show it to you in meme form now.
To be sitting here next to Alexander Dugin. The first time I heard the name Dugin, it was thrown at me as an epithet. And it was in 2014.
Few moments later.
And around that time, a number of people began to denounce me in left-wing circles. I was called NAZBOL. I was called a Strasserist. And one of the favorite epithets that people began throwing at me was I was called a Duginist.
12 seconds later.
And I did not know what a Duginist was. I did not know who Alexander Dugin was. So I had to look into this. I had to look it up.
Soon after.
And when I was in Iran, I remember at this conference I attended, many of the guests from around the world said to me, you've got to read the writings of Alexander Dugin.
By sheer coincidence.
The leader was quoting, Lenin and Trotsky and such, but they talked a lot different than the leftists in the United States talked.
5 minutes later.
And so, with all of these people mentioning Dugin to me, with people accusing me of being a Duginist, I thought it would be best that I actually study the writings of Alexander Dugin. So,
2 very boring minutes later.
I had to get a copy of The Fourth Political Theory, and I read the book cover to cover, and it was fascinating to me as someone who'd only really studied the political left and the ideology around it to see a wider analysis of the world. And there were many things in the book that I did agree with.
Much, much, much later.
And as I read The Fourth Political Theory, I noticed that I had been kind of aware of what he was describing in this text for a long time.
A few inches later.
What Mr. Dugin has described in his work, which, is very meaningful and people are reading it all over the world, is very real, and people should engage with his ideas.
1 pair of pants later.
And so, the ideas that Mr. Dugin has promoted have been very meaningful for me in trying to make sense of what's going on in the world.
End of flashback.
And now, what exactly is Duginism? Allow us to read from this far-right publication, Counterpunch. Many discussions around Alexander Dugin in print have outlined his vast, often contradictory influences, background, and ideological trajectory. For example, Dugin's traditionalism, or neo-traditionalism, i.e. his adherence to the ideas of French Sufi Muslim convert René Guénon and the Italian Julius Evola, have detailed by Mark Sedgwick and others. However, in the more recent years, Dugin's traditionalism appears to be overstated, since his fanatical, almost messianic Heideggerianism, face-to-face with the dismissive, often overtly hostile views, many eminent figures of the traditionalist school towards Martin Heidegger seem placed outside of the proverbial neo-traditionalist pale. Comments made in an early chapter of his 2014 book, Martin Heidegger, The Philosophy of Another Beginning, where Heidegger has been elevated by Dugin to the status of culminating eschatological figure on par with the Prophet of Islam, only reinforces such negatively held views about Dugin's anti-traditionalism among some contemporary neo-traditionalists. As such, Alexander Dugin purported traditionalism, which used to serve at one point for his biological headliner, is no longer a reliable feature, which can make it uncritically at face value. If he once was, or at least Dugin is no longer a neo-traditionalist of any meaningful sense, which makes use of the appropriation of the term by North American white nationalist acolytes of Dugin, such as Matthew Heimbach, hold even less validity. Therefore, to continue discussing Dugin's current ideas and stances in light of the Guénonian Avolian traditionalism, it can be misleading because he has in recent times moved in the opposite direction into what some neo-traditionalists would characterize as counter-initiatic currents and the counter-tradition. The misanthropic ideas of British occultists and Satanists Aleister Crowley do, however, inform both the Duginist worldview and its contemporary praxis. Indeed, it is in with the worldview of chaos magic specifically, which is a spawn of Crowley's Thelemic philosophy, and especially in his fourth positionist catchcall of beyond right or left must be sought, since this is, whether explicitly articulated or not, the actual animating locus of Duginist far-right praxis, beginning with his choice of symbology, the Eurasian flag of 8 white or yellow thunderbolts or arrows shaped in a radical pattern and is set on a black background. This symbol by itself is alternatively referred to as chaos magic as the wheels of chaos, the symbols of chaos, the arms of chaos, the arrows of chaos, the chaos star, or the chaos cross, or the chaos sphere. Man, there's a new term. Or the symbol of 8. Somewhat reminiscent of the Thule Society when Hitler's own appropriation of the swastika from the writings of Theosophical Society founder H.P. Blavatsky, Dugin derives his design from the polarizations of it made by Western chaos magicians during the 1970s and 1980s, who they themselves appropriated from the work of British science fiction and fantasy novelist Michael Moorcock. It should be noted here that both the numbers of the 8 as well as the color of black play a pivotal role in all neo-Nazi far-right symbology, not to mention the Wheels of Chaos itself maintains a striking similarity to the well-known sun wheel, a symbol used by the SS and many contemporary neo-Nazis. In his own defense, Dugin would probably assert that the number of 8 holds importance to the correspondences within esoteric Christianity, as well as it refers to Christ. However, his obvious, or dubious rather, choice of the Wheel of Chaos over the cross would tend to refute that claim. In addition, as a self-proclaimed Russian nationalist, it is not clear exactly why Alexander Dugin would choose his chief symbol from the sources located within the traditions of British occultism, rather than those from the native Russia, or rather, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, as he claims to adhere to. This point alone, we believe, further reinforces the allegations regarding Dugin's anti-traditionalism, while simultaneously locating him in a very different universe, although one that he claims to be speaking for. Be that as it may, such behavior in itself would be quite consistent with chaos magic's basic dictum regarding the malleability of its beliefs and their pliability as tools at the hands of the chaos magician. Here it is that the nation's will to power in itself becomes the prime motivation of the black magnus turned political activist. Emerging from this, the next significant formula of chaos magic is that of continual paradigm shift, or the constant arbitrary changing of beliefs, where holding contradictory positions simultaneously becomes the vehicle for self-realization and understanding the coincidentia oppositorium underlying all phenomena. As a spiritual practice, and this is a mouthful of words, I'm sorry. As a spiritual practice, there are a number of correlations and comparisons that can be made within this specific idea amongst many traditions around the globe, whether it be like Sufi, Tantric, Zen, and in and of itself is neutral. Except that with Dugin and his acolytes, the issue is not linked to any specific spiritual practice and its realization per se, as rather is purely political praxis and the will to power in its crudest forms. In other words, for Dugin, the alchemical laboratory of Ars Operatia resides not in and of itself, but rather the greater world in the theater of politics, where Black Magnus acts to emanate the echelon, where the echelon presents itself in the inversion of all values. Now, if you're right now just swimming in concepts, obviously they're trying to approach this from someone who's tried to analyze Dugin's work, and there's going to be obviously some strange concepts therein. The Philosopher's Stone for Dugin and thus power all over the world for its own sake and not over the self. This includes over features of thinking and what informs paradigmatic beyond left and right catch-call latched on by Duginists. It's also what makes Duginism particularly dangerous as an ideology and a movement. In other words, in the worldview where chaos magic acts as the ideological primum mobile, occultist principles are made to serve fundamentally fascist political programs. Some would also call this a form of Satanism, and yet when other manifestations of this very modernity and the materialist West that Alexander Dugin and otherwise rallied against. Arguably, whatever else Dugin says to criticize and distance himself from it, Hitlerian National Socialism attempted precisely the very same thing, animated and as it was by almost identical underlying ideological concerns and motivations. That said, René Guénon alleged that Blavatsky and her Theosophical Society during the 19th and early 20th century were essentially acting in capacity of a colonialist Trojan horse put up by the Imperial British Secret Services in order to infiltrate and disrupt the traditional religious subcultures of the subcontinent. Given Dugin's networks in Iran, Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere in the Islamic world, not to mention Eastern Europe, it is not entirely out of the realm of possibility that similar patterns and inducements may be motivating an underlying Duginist recruitment agenda, wherein Dugin himself can be seen with the new Blavatsky and his network successor to the Theosophical Society come British Imperial Trojan horse. Certainly, their attempt to break it down further has already fractured left-right spectrum in Europe in order to recruit for the far right appears to speak, given that there's an unambiguously racist and reactionary rhetoric for the immigration refugee crisis on the face of things, otherwise defies the alliances that have been made inside the Islamic world amongst Iranians, Iraqis, Lebanese, Syrians, and other sectors of resistance axis. Russia and the European refugee crisis and the far-right Duginist geopolitics in action. Now, the instrumental role of NATO in the collapse of the Libyan state in 2011, the Syrian war that is now going on its fifth year, ISIS, Ukraine, and above all else the European refugee crisis appear to be providing Duginists a rare opportunity to exploit existing splits arising amongst cross-sections of Western anti-war left, as well as amongst activists in the Muslim community itself, in order to recruit amongst these groups. This is especially evident in the recent talking points adopted by a number of otherwise progressive and left-leaning pundits who regularly appear on RT, also known as Russia Today, and elsewhere in alternative media where the consistently anti-war stance with regard to Syria specifically and Western imperialism generally has, in paradoxical fashion, given way instead to a melange of reactionary narratives over the European refugee crisis. In short, we have a situation where certain progressives and even some Muslims have adopted the contemporary white supremacist Kulturkampf rhetoric of fascists that allow fellow travelers of largely victimized and Mideast and North African immigrants and asylum seekers in Europe, where the right-wing hysteria over a perceived threat of European culture and its way of life is uncritically repeated to varying degrees paired fashion. Wherein some blame Russian state policy directly for such recent developments, the point of view of the present author is that such a turn of events ultimately benefits the agendas of the empires itself, rather than Russia specifically, such as these Duginists may in fact be sheepdogging for long-term Anglo-American Atlanticist policy initiatives rather than specifically Russian ones. Be that as it may, rumors around the Russian state has been a generous donor and in some cases outright finance protracted periods of fascist far-right groups in such as the Jobbik in Hungary and the Golden Dawn in Greece. And by the way, these aren't usually mentioned when people only want to talk about the Azov Battalion in Ukraine. Since 2014 in Germany, for instance, the AfD, which is the far-right group in Germany, the NDP, and Pegida are alleged to have received substantial financial support from Moscow as a means of destabilizing Merkel and the German center, who were key actions and sanctions imposed on Russia following the annexation of Crimea in March 2014. Similarly, it's held regarding Le Pen's Front National in France. Certainly much of the anti-immigration, anti-refugee jingoism published in the early stages of RT, Russia Today, as of that time would face things that happened to support these allegations. Now, this is obviously a lot to wrap your head around when you're first reading about this, but you were certainly seeing that and this narrative that has been pushed for a while. Basically, the leftists in this case, who are basically people who are working primarily on Russia Today, are often talking about this from the perspective of, yes, imperialism bad, empires bad, and we're specifically going to talk exclusively about the US in this regard, and then utilize what is a very strong contingent of people in Europe who are obviously, fostering racist divisions when they want to talk about immigration and how there's a change in the cultural background, and uniting those together. And this is where the whole thing becomes, increasingly frightening. However, even in that, it's not clear how much these policies would strategically benefit Russia in the long term. Since these are the very same forces that Russia ostensibly supports at the moment, could go quite easily marshaled at any point in the future by its Anglo-American geopolitical rival and used against Russia itself, as is the case with Ukraine, amply demonstrates. Certainly, it could be argued that Russia and Anglo-American Atlanticists are using competing far-right proxies against each other's interests on the continent as a form of asymmetrical warfare, with Germany as one of the key battlegrounds and refugee issues as a linchpin. But then this would tend to indicate some kind of split in the fascist international, while also explaining one reason for the aggressive recruitment efforts presently undertaken by the Duginists, especially amongst Muslim and disenfranchised leftists without a home on social media and elsewhere. So, as there is right now becoming an increasing call for the support of Ukraine, and there are people obviously, and I would say the vast majority of the left in North America, for example, have realized this for what it is, right? They're not trying to take away any of the agency from Vladimir Putin and his actions and saying that this is in fact the actions of Vladimir Putin. You can talk about the historical connotations, you can talk about the pressures of NATO, you can talk about the US involvement in the 2014 uprising. There's a ton of things you can talk about in that regard, but you also cannot just say that Vladimir Putin operates and or behaves in a manner in which it's just like, oh, well, he has no control over what he does. I mean, this is purely the work of the United States. No, doing that is completely intellectually dishonest. And at this point, to be honest, completely asinine to continue down this route. But it is a very interesting and frightening time for elements of either progressives and leftists, of whom you will see people like Infrared decidedly despise, very similar to Duginists. It's one of the reasons why Caleb Maupin has spent so much time trying to push this narrative that is breadtube serves imperialism. Breadtube serves imperialism, because it's the imperialists of the United States that are getting bolstered by all these big breadtubers, many of which, like, the reason why the whole breadtube serves imperialism thing I thought was just utterly absurd at the beginning was that it really looks like he's writing an entire book about his personal beefs, right? It's like T, the novel, where he's talking frequently about all these things that have taken place, and brings up people who have had no interactions or done anything in regards to talking about Caleb Maupin, like ContraPoints, for example. She's mentioned heavily in his book, but the entire idea and thesis is that these bread tubers, whether they're directly funded by the CIA or some other government body, are looking to uphold and or promote the ideas of Western imperialism, specifically US imperialism, through their discussions and programming and that kind of stuff, which I'm sure anyone who's hearing me say this out loud right now is like, that is absolutely ridiculous. Like, if anything, if someone who is a YouTuber is pushing what you consider to be pro-US imperialism talking points, but they also happen to be doing so under the banner of a leftist, it could have a lot more to do rather than this weird conspiracy theory of people like, dark assassins trying to get Caleb Maupin with CIA funding and all this kind of stuff, rather than going down that narrative of someone, if they happen to grow up in the United States, most likely they have been indoctrinated by US media their entire lives and indoctrinated by the Western way of thinking. And so that, that will have a lot more influence upon what they may be saying that you consider to be pro-imperialist than any fucking CIA funded op or anything like that. Like, that's when you're going into Alex Jones territory by doing so. Moreover, can be said, but whatever rhetoric Duginists spin amongst the assorted activist communities to draw them in on its own merits, Duginism is neither authentically anti-imperialist, nor does it genuinely hold any left-wing values. Nor, for that matter, is it traditionalism either. Rather, on all fronts, Duginism actually represents a carefully smokescreen form of fascist white separatism, which is yet to say another ideological permutation of Euro-American white supremacy that has organized itself into a movement. Dugin's own skewed definitions of Eurasia, where in the scheme Eurasia merely represents the horizontal landmass between Vladivostok and Libsyn, and and where all Southwest and Southeast Asia are categorically excluded from it, reinforces this fact. As such, the seductive dangers represented by Duginism and its network from any united front against empire amongst anti-imperialist left and anti-Slavist Muslims cannot be underestimated. So, I mean, we've had Caleb Maupin in his own, speech talking about how, Dugin, and the flag is right behind them, by the way, is completely misunderstood. Oh, by the way, also the right, like Lawrence Southern, love Dugin too. They've interviewed him as well.
Idea to be right or left or to be left has lost its relevance, has lost its meaning, because liberal center, globalists, they control left and right, and only when we arrived at the most extreme
Gandalf the white supremacist, that's good.
And right, they are losing a little bit control. So we need to take right and left from them and unite right and left on the other pole. That is idea of creating a kind of anti-central theory based on the common denominator between left populism and right populism. So we should be populist centrists.
Populist centrists.
People when it demands
it's a rebranding, you see,
or traditional identity.
Now, to change gears here for the last couple questions, don't worry, I know.
Because I have absolutely no pushback on anything you say, by the way.
But we really, as
just music to my ears.
Looking into religion, we're curious about
basically drag, but unironic.
The resurgence of religion in Russia.
Now, here's the thing: if you were like, my viewpoint, again, as a humanist, is that I don't like empires suck. I am fucking sick and tired of empires, and that includes the US one, all right? That includes, yes, and it needs to be prefaced with this every single fucking time right now, because when we discuss these things, people are just going to come out and be like, oh, the pro-imperialist stance once again. The US empire, by far, is the largest, does the most damage, has the most military bases, is the world's largest arms manufacturer, and the world's largest arms dealer. I don't see, and this is the way they are framing this, the solution to be more empires rising up and fighting that empire, and then we're going to have that. I want to see a demilitarization of the United States. I want to see a de-escalation of the United States. I want to see a rollback of the United States military and the military-industrial complex. I do not want to see 338 or so million Americans suffer and die so that we can finally rid the world of U.S. imperialism. Like, when people start to frame things in this way, it becomes very, very yikesy to me, because it's all, like, honestly, this is where, and I know this is a handful of keyboard warriors who do this, right? But if your worldview is ultimately that, like, oh, death to America, we have to end the American empire, like, do you hate Americans or do you hate the American empire? They're two very separate things. The same thing can be said right now about Russia and the actions of Vladimir Putin and his government. That does not make me want to see the suffrage of millions and millions of Russians, who unfortunately will be the ones who are going to suffer when and as their economy continues to collapse under sanctions. Like, oligarchs, the uber wealthy, the rich, the elites, as they like to call them, they're very insulated from a lot of these kind of things. They have a lot of investments overseas. Like, not to say that the entire action doesn't force pressure upon Putin. It absolutely would, especially if you become a worldwide pariah for your actions. But at the same time, that does not make me in any way hate Russian people. I love all people, This is something that needs to be said.
Particularly Christianity. Do you believe there has been a resurgence in Russia? And do you think there is any chance of a resurgence of Christian identity within the other Atlantic parts of the West?
So
yeah, hate systems, not people. Be kind to people. Be ruthless to systems.
You're right. There is certainly a resurgence of religion in Russia, and the void left by the end of the communism ideology is filled presently by religion. So that is little by little we are returning to religious world vision. Orthodox Christianity.
If you've been wondering what this all is, by the way, if you hear often like discussions of fourth world, Eurasianism and stuff like that, it's most likely coming at some point or another from Alexander Dugin.
When you get ill, do you go to a doctor at all?
No, I don't believe in doctors. I don't believe in pills. I believe in the force of the prayer and in the mystical effects of anointment. If the hand leads you to the hell, cut it. If your eyes lead you to the hell, take them away. So to be blind and to be mutilated is better if the salvation of the soul is on the stake. So I suggest to follow that directly. First of all, consider...
The question was, do you believe in doctors? It's like, no, I don't believe them. I believe in holy sacraments and ointments. And then you're like, okay.
Not the value of the healing or healthcare, but the reason of the illness.
Oh, is Dugin directly influencing Putin? I think, like, I've heard both directions of that. I think you get kind of into the conspiratorial war hawkish side of both liberal and conservative media. Like, that's something Glenn Beck used to love doing back in the day. He would have, like, those massive chalkboards and be like, the true leader of Russia is Alexander Dugin, and you can see now as we look and draw all the lines here, and I'm going to do the fucking, Charlie Kelly thing. Like, that is one direction that it goes in. You also hear, like, big liberal discussions. Like, I think Big Think has a whole video where someone is like, Alexander Dugin influences more Russian politics than we give him power to admit. But, like, I haven't seen direct evidence that, like, Alexander Dugin is like the Putin's whisperer or something.
If there is God, everything has a meaning. Everything has some special goal and special lesson to give us. So, including the worst thing that happened, they are teaching us something. And if we get the lesson, it is the best result at all. Not try to readjust, repair. If something is falling down, we need to understand why, not to keep it. Maybe that is something evil. For example, Soviet Empire has collapsed. In order to save it at any price, we need to understand, was it really something that we needed to save? So, and that is the same materialistically. We should repair and conserve and ameliorate everything. Not at all. We should be we should concentrate it, first of all, on the meaning of the life we live, or the meaning of the object we are dealing with.
So my just quick take on this would be that if you do have a medical problem, please go see a doctor and get it checked out. It'll most likely help you more than cutting off your hand because you think it has been possessed by Satan or something to that effect. And I know people are going to criticize me and say, like, oh, you don't understand the actual metaphysics at work here, Lance. And truthfully, I would still recommend that if you do have something like I don't know, broken fingers or something to that effect, I would probably go see a doctor about it. So yeah, that's just my quick little debunking of the Russia Today stuff.
What they really need is
It's the exact same story. Al Jazeera repeats the same stories on a pretty consistent loop. Let's see what the libs are saying.
Suddenly,
OMG.
we've seen a lot of things on the Real.
Using his cell phone, some of the things that his father said at home, and those recordings will be played in court. So it'll be quite dramatic. And I think the task for the prosecutors will be to draw out this testimony without appearing to push them too hard, which could...
Roman Abramovich hands Chelsea stewardship to the club's charity trust following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Wow. Also, I thought soccer and football, Europeans are going to get all over me for this, but I thought football was something that was supposed to be apolitical, and you're seeing a lot of politics coming out right now.
Fire and make the jury think, well, you're trying to squeeze this guy's children to testify against him. So it's a tricky line the government's going to have to walk there.
I know you'll be staying on top of it for us, Pete Williams. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. Coming up, big floods rip through Australia, leaving several people dead. We've got more details on the country's so-called rain bomb later in the show. And a new report from the United Nations says...
just because I know this is thoroughly going to piss off Duginists to use his fucking Rational Wiki article and anything, but I do want to read out some of this. Alexander Dugin is a Russian fascist who claims to have created the fourth political theory beyond capitalism, communism, and fascism, combining the best elements of all three. Dugin's fourth political theory is just a rehashing of third positionism, sometimes that was described long before Dugin was born by Gregor Strasser, also known as Strasserism. Most people in the civilized world, well except for a few, deem him as the hate monger and Nazi Stalinist who rhetorically promotes expansionist wars for reclaiming of Mother Russia to its former glory without ever gone to actual wars himself, despite being or much more likely claiming to be one of Vladimir Putin's pet ideologues. The Nazi-Stalinist party is actually true. His stated political position is national Bolshevism. Dugin's influences include a variety of anti-Semites and Nazis, Michael Serrano, Jean Parvulesco, and the Nazi party philosopher Carl Schmitt. Dugin's irredentist view of Russian nationalism is based on the concept of Eurasianism, a concept that is developed by Lev Gumiev, and adding to Nazi ideology. Eurasianism is Dugin's conception that does not regard Belarus or Ukraine as independent entities from Russia. Dugin's Eurasianism is opposed to the rule of law. It is opposed to the European Union and Atlanticism. In the principle, not based on specific actions, it views the rule of law and Western alliances as Jewish and hence inherently anti-Semitic. Dugin's dismissed fellow fascist and Putin's most influential philosopher, Ivan Ilyin, is an inferior philosopher. Despite this, according to historian Timothy Schneider, much of Dugin's writing and reads like a parody of him. Putin has referenced all three of them in his attempts to justify an autocracy. In 1993, he co-founded with Emil Yumanov the National Bolsheviks Party of Russia. It's now been closed down. His most significant accomplishments are writing a book on geopolitics titled appropriately enough The Foundations of Geopolitics, derived from obscure radical traditionalists and reactionary ideologues such as Julius Evola, Nimrod Rosario, a believer in esoteric Nazism, and a weird blend of Nazi occultism, neo-Gnosticism, and theophilosophy, claiming that Hitler was some kind of divine being who incarnated to purge the world of degeneracy or whatnot, claiming that Tulocracy and land-based politics partially based on ley lines, more inherently stable than thalassocracy, a sea-based politics based on pseudo-historical Atlantis, and reincarnated as Western European seaborne empires, and that NATO and the US alliance known as Atlanticism, which former promotes peace, stability, tradition, and family, while the later promotes degeneracy, aka human rights, democracy, small illiberalism, which is somehow now bad. And you can see, like, now we're getting into the more liberal side of whoever wrote this article. Writing out that his batshit insane ideology, a book called The Fourth Political Theory, which mixes the philosophies of Martin Heidegger, Gilles Deleuze, and Félix Guattari, and situationalists who outright demand World War III, so something like that will prevail. Writing a slew of other batshit insane books where he exalts glorious Mother Russia and longs for the good old days of both Stalinism and Tsarism, fiercely denounces the very idea of Ukraine, and enthusiastically endorsing Donald Trump as the President of the United States, meeting and getting interviewed by Lauren Southern and Brittany Pettibone, two far-right pundits who were banned in the UK.
There's this report out tonight one scientist calls the "Your House is on Fire" report. This UN climate report that explains just how dangerous this is and how it's going to affect every part of the planet. Look at this. I found heat waves,
There's a new Amber Hawk video.
floods, already exceeding what plants and animals can actually tolerate, putting...
Holy shit. That Tucker Carlson looks so good. It's wild to see him, like, just improving in real time.
The DOJ can tell you precisely how many Qurans were burned last year, but they don't keep track of Christmas trees. Why is that? Well, because they could care less. The DOJ...
Man. What's it called when things are becoming so real that they're scary again? The paradox? Uncanny Valley, thank you.
Both of them say the same thing. If we don't act right this very minute, if countries and humanity doesn't immediately start taking steps to reduce global warming, it will consume us. Now, the numbers are kind of interesting, right? Over the last 150 years or so, they believe the planet has warmed by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. You may think, well, that's no big deal, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the average across the globe. It's been much more in some areas, as you well know. Summers in Phoenix, summers in the African Sahara, for example, are much hotter than they used to be. And their concern is, if we get warmer by another 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit through the next 80 years, then we will likely see most of the coral reefs in this country, in the world rather, die. 29% of species could go extinct. They go on and on and on, talking about millions of people who will not have access to clean water, not have food, crops will be dying, livestock will not be able to produce at the levels that they do now. I mean, it is very, very concerning, but it's very academic and very research intensive. 270 scientists from around the world are a part of this report.
Do I think house prices on Mars will rival Vancouver?
Call,
yes.
Trying to tell the leaders of the world, we have to act right now.
And there are some signs in it, Tom, from what I understand, that like things are, you know, if we're not totally moving in the right direction, fewer people are dying around the world in the last 50 years from storms and floods and other extreme weather, right? So scientists think that we could maybe avoid some of the absolute worst case scenarios. But what do we have to do to get there?
Well, if we are using technology, if we, in fact, and that's the bottom line of how we have...
I think we're like 3 years away from someone actually suggesting what Duginist just said, push the planet slightly further from the sun. It's like, all right, we've all seen what needs to be done. We need to fire a large amount of rockets in one direction just simultaneously, and then the whole world will hopefully push itself slightly more out of orbit. Don't worry, the gravitational pull of the other planets won't be affected by this anyway. Yeah, that was a Futurama episode. That's right. I was like, where do I know this from?
News tonight. Was there anything that surprised you?
I think really, you know, you come away from it really kind of depressed and thinking, my goodness gracious, what kind of a planet are we leaving our kids and our grandkids? Listen, highly unlikely I'm going to be around in 80 years, right? But I really, I hate the idea that my kids and grandkids are going to be living in a world that is literally becoming uninhabitable in many, many, many places. And, you know, when you look at the science that's gone into this, and these are not a bunch of, you know, one of the scientists I talked to said, listen, these are not a bunch of tree huggers. These are some of the world's best scientists putting their best research into this to try to have a good feeling for what's happening. Yeah. And in her words, the country is, the world rather, simply cannot absorb all the carbon that we are feeding it. And as a result, it is quickly going into a chain reaction, and it's a spiral.
Let's see what's on APTN. Live newscast will begin shortly. APTN is the Aboriginal news network of Canada, and it's across the country. It's in every province.
On Monday, it follows an appeal for help by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Those are the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after People and Power. Goodbye.
In a notorious waterside community where kings and thugs rule, one theatre director ventures to stage a play.
They call me Miss.
Quote.
That ain't on mine.
Can I do that? 1951.
Ukraine can see off the advance of Russian troops. Well, a lot of people are. And it might look surprising, perhaps, from the outside, because you see the might of the Russian military that Vladimir Putin has gathered around several of the country's borders. And this, of course, is a complex and multi-pronged assault. But you speak to people and they are very optimistic. Lots of them have this incredible spirit of resistance, and there's been videos going viral on social media here of famous actors, singers, and people in public life who've also volunteered to join these territorial defense forces.
And that's France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent reporting from south-central Ukraine. While Russian attacks have been focused mostly on Kiev and Kharkiv, there are incursions happening across the country. People who live in rural areas west of the...
Oh, so Chelsea said that I can share her reading. Unclear completely to get a clear number on casualties, but there are ballparks. I would say 5K is high, but still the numbers are much higher than the Russians ever expected to experience. I'm ignoring social media and reading raw telegrams from pros who care more about tactics and facts and picking a side, vets, intel types, equipment needs and stuff. Directly from that, international arms sales do play a large role, but most likely it's the collapse of the Ukrainian command and control of the comms, a mixed military-civilian militia effort organized on the fronts using cell phone apps to share intel, coordinate with ad hoc military units with a military attachment. Not quite guerrilla, but a step towards it. Ukraine is putting out a lot of disinformation, but they are clearly wearing down the Russian will to fight. The lines have crystallized so much. Personally, I see the apocryphal stories about an old lady or a guy on a bridge annoying. They are almost always made up and unimportant to the actual fighting. If it's one story about one person, it's usually propaganda, is a good rule, but the larger picture cannot be denied. Yeah, so basically, it is in Chelsea's assessment striking to see the amount of resistance that's put up by Ukrainian forces in this case. Currently watching a combo of me and John Oliver. Is John Oliver live right now?
We're going to fight the Russians and defend ourselves any way possible.
Is John Oliver streaming?
We'll fight them, of course. We're not going to let them stay and give them food.
Checkpoints like this are springing up all over the district, all over the country, in fact. The work of volunteers. Local kids are also involved.
There were more people here before, but they left because there wasn't much work.
Did you hear Putin say today he wants to prepare the nuclear weapons?
Don't worry, we'll shoot those missiles down with catapults.
Joking aside, this spirit of...
How do you ask that question to people who are like, you know, part of it is like, oh man, that feels irresponsible. How do you feel about the possibility of nukes being dropped on you and your country?
The capital, Kiev. Well, the United Nations says more than 500,000 people have fled Ukraine in the last 5 days. Thousands more have been displaced inside the country. France 24's Emmanuel Chaz reports from the border between Poland and Ukraine.
Here I'm at one of the checkpoints in Harabene. You can see at the very back there's a checkpoint, there's Ukraine behind that, and around 50 to 60 people passing through every hour. I was talking to a firefighter earlier. Firefighters here are very involved.
Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form, available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we beseech thee to smite down our enemies. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are but your humble court jesters, here to amuse you. To our lords, Trevor R., we give thanks for this spit of land for us to eke out this meager existence. To our knights, Merid, Cheryl Alvarez, Ruby Kelly, Ellie Leslie, Alex P., Brandon, Words Greenwood, Nate, that one guy, Hagbird Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariane McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Coulter Smith, Val 9000, Jenna Tall, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multimondi, Trevor Yanis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojak, Saren 42, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Nkosin, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We raise our flag in a veil, and we salute you, our friends.